Mesdames et messieurs, Excellences, Mesdames et messieurs, chers amis, nous avons le grand privilège et le grand plaisir d'accueillir ce soir Monsieur Peter Maurer. Privilège et plaisir parce que Monsieur Maurer est le président du Comité international de la Croix-Rouge, qu'il est une personnalité remarquable à plusieurs égards, en tout cas c'est ce que diront toutes les personnes qui ont eu la chance de le connaître un peu, et parce que c'est une personnalité qui aujourd'hui relève des défis très importants. Vous me direz que chaque président du CICR a eu à relever de grands défis, mais je crois que ce que Peter Maurer nous dira ce soir des défis actuels du CICR nous fera comprendre que le travail qui est le sien, la mission qu'il a entrepris de mener depuis 2 ans à présent, après avoir été un diplomate suisse de haut vol, si je peux ainsi vous qualifier, à Berne, mais pendant plusieurs années à New York, où il a représenté la Suisse auprès de l'Organisation des Nations Unies. Peter Maurer est une personne qui frappe à la fois par son intelligence tout à fait remarquable, et j'allais dire remarquable parmi les diplomates suisses, mais c'est peut-être trop gentil. En tout cas, remarquable dans le monde de la diplomatie. Je ne sais si son doctorat en histoire et ses études en histoire et en droit international l'ont aidé à devenir ce qu'il est devenu. En tout cas, sa personnalité, à la fois sévère, ascétique peut-être, et tournée vers autrui, à donner à l'écoute et à l'analyse des problèmes, est un des traits marquants de sa personne. Donc c'est avec un très grand plaisir que je lui donne la parole pour nous expliquer comment le CICR, dans la perspective qui est la sienne, doit à la fois combiner l'art de la diplomatie, les opérations sur le terrain avec le souci de venir au secours des personnes qui en ont besoin, et le respect de principes qui font toute la force de cette organisation. Merci, Peter.
Merci beaucoup, Philippe. Mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues, c'est un grand plaisir d'être avec vous et d'être avec vous à un moment quand même presque historique, à la préouverture la Maison de la Paix. Je pense que c'est une excellente occasion aussi pour moi, en tant que président du CICR, d'être ici au moment où la paix enfin trouve un domicile. Et donc, je suis enchanté de voir cette construction, cette possibilité d'échange, et je m'en réjouis beaucoup d'échanger avec vous ce soir. Il y a 200 ans, je pense, Genève déjà était au carrefour de la pensée européenne, avec Charles Pictet de Rochemont, constructeur et penseur non seulement de la neutralité suisse, mais aussi de l'Europe, avec Henri Dunant, qui a réfléchi sur l'humanitaire et qui a fait de l'humanitaire une vraie profession et un vrai domaine de politique publique. Et je pense ce soir, j'essaierai de vous entretenir un peu, non seulement sur l'harmonie entre l'ambition de la paix et l'humanitaire, mais aussi sur certaines tensions et sur certains problèmes quand les ambitions importantes de paix et les ambitions de protéger un espace humanitaire minimum se rencontrent dans l'espace politique et dans la pratique d'aujourd'hui. I understand this is a public which is as much Anglophone than Francophone, and I will start with my presentation in English and make, over the next half hour, a couple of remarks on humanitarian diplomacy and principled action at the crossroads. What I would like to do is really to reflect on the relevance of humanitarian principles in guiding today's international response to armed conflict. Let me just set the stage first by situating the discussion. Over 20 billion US dollars are invested each year in responding to the essential needs of populations affected by humanitarian crises, including natural disaster, armed conflicts, and other situations of violence. An estimated 250,000 humanitarian workers are engaged in these operations, many of which take place in highly hazardous environments, such as Ukraine, Syria, Iraq, South Sudan, Central African Republic, Eastern Congo, and now Liberia with the Ebola pandemic. Relief and protection programs in favor of these populations affected are guided by humanitarian principles, building on the century-old experience of humanitarian professionals and distinguishing the humanitarian response from purely political, on the one side, or charitable activities, and providing a framework to deal with some of the most sensitive dilemmas with which you can be confronted in the real world of conflict. What are those dilemmas? Dilemmas of priority setting in situations of overwhelming needs and limited resources, between fulfilling our commitment to humanity and taking into account the stark realities of power, injustice, and discrimination in many areas of operations. Between access to populations and security and safety for the humanitarian personnel, and many more dilemmas. Several guiding principles have emerged over the recent years, including the ones of accountability and participation of beneficiaries and do no harm principles and the quest for sustainability of relief efforts. None of them has matched the historical importance of the principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence, which are at the center of ICRC's mission and identity, and which remain uncontested in the broader international community. These principles belong to the fundamentals of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. They were also the main sources of inspiration of the guiding principles of the United Nations Action and United Nations General Assembly Resolution of 1991. They have been at the heart of all major operations for over a century. And yet, questions arise today about their relevance in addressing new and emerging challenges and in a broadening humanitarian agenda. What are those challenges? Look at the prolonged nature of some of the current conflicts. Afghanistan, DRC, Colombia, Sudan, and the prolonged situations of occupation like Palestine, Gaza, leading to a disintegration of state infrastructure. This disintegration of state infrastructure affects the ability of public authorities to deliver basic services like health, education, nutrition, water, or law and order. Most of the priority conflicts of today have been on top of our agenda at ICRC for decades, while humanitarian action and principle were first and foremost developed to respond to a temporary crisis. Look at the superposition of different factors weakening states and society: poverty, armed conflict, intercommunal violence, crime, undermining fragile states and societies, as we witness again in Central African Republic, Somalia, or Yemen. Look at the prevalent character of warfare, which is mostly affecting densely populated areas, leading to mass destructions and mass displacements. Where are the battlefields today? in Gaza, Lugansk, Aleppo, Bentiu, Gao, and in many other densely populated areas where millions of people live. Look at the changing character of non-state armed groups, carrying increasingly radical ideologies, feeding on corruption, exclusion, and injustice, under which populations suffered before, and opposing today through their behavior and through their words and ideas some of the most basic humanitarian values. Again, as illustrated almost every day. Look at the current dynamic of these destructured and unstructured conflicts with effects of hostilities across entire regions and the displacement of large parts of the affected populations. What started as the Syrian crisis 3 years ago is today a regional breakdown of systems, water, sanitation, health, education, with global and long-term effects. Even more so, the instability in the countries of the Sahel and Sub-Saharan Africa has become a big regional and global area of instability. We are thus confronted today with transforming vulnerabilities of populations and needs beyond the traditional scope of humanitarian actions, like food, water, shelter, medicine. We see patterns of sexual violence emerge, calling for psychosocial responses. We see massive traumas of displaced populations needing more than war surgery as a response. We see children displaced in masses and demanding for educational facilities and programs as a core expectation to humanitarian actors. So we are far beyond the definition of humanitarian action as a core survival of livelihoods. In short, we witness the broadening of the humanitarian response, or in other words, an increasing number of activities which fall under the category of humanitarian action today. In response to these challenges, the international community has mobilized its energies to address not only the immediate consequences of these emergencies on populations, but also to deal with their causes and prevent their resurgence in more consistent and coherent manner. It has set up monitoring mechanisms, the Security Council, the Human Rights Council, to gather information on evolving situations of concerns and vulnerabilities. It has developed regional and international peacemaking and enforcing capabilities, equipped like the peacekeeping operations recently with enforcement and protection mandates. It has fostered development programs for conflict-affected populations. No development agency today which would lack a conflict prevention division. And it has renewed its attempts to bring perpetrators of violence to justice with the special tribunals and the International Criminal Court. Doing so, the international community has integrated the traditional emergency response and humanitarian action into a complex architecture of developmental, security, political, judiciary, programs drawing from various legal regimes, international humanitarian law, human rights law, refugee law, criminal law, making reference to international as well as national and regional jurisdictions. Since the Millennium Summit in the year 2000, the international community has to a large extent embraced and concretized the concept of integrated, comprehensive, and holistic approach to crises and to conflict and underdevelopment. While we at the ICRC certainly recognize the significance of greater integration of international programs in the international community's strategy in contemporary crises, we also wonder about the specific role of humanitarianism in today's national and international response to such complex emergencies. There is a growing tension between the international efforts aiming at finding sustainable political solutions to ongoing crises, on the one hand, and offering life-saving support to the most vulnerable populations according to strict requirements of impartiality and neutrality. While the two objectives can be combined in practice, there are situations such as Syria or Ukraine, where providing life-saving assistance to affected population has been subjugated to political maneuverings of the parties. Over the last year, we have witnessed in Geneva 1 and 2 on Syria how the impossibility to addressing the political causes of the conflict has brought the UN and regional mediators to negotiate humanitarian access to besieged areas against larger political agendas, or as a first step of confidence building in a transitional project and process. The signal was thus given to the parties, willing or unwilling, that humanitarian requirements were not obligations to follow as a matter of principle and practice, but moreover as an issue to negotiate in the context of an overall political settlement. The same applies to the negotiations of relief convoys in Ukraine, facing at times incompressible political obstacles from all sides due to the inability of all parties concerned to maintain a minimum of shared responsibility for the assistance and protection of over 1 million civilians affected by the armed conflict. Connecting humanitarian and political negotiation this way inevitably hijacks life-saving operations and impacts negatively on the credibility of international humanitarian actors. This is the reason why ICRC, in Syria, Ukraine, and elsewhere, is tirelessly offering credible alternatives to such situation, and which are compatible with fundamental humanitarian principles and implementable in practice. What does it mean? It means defining precise modalities for access, control of goods, transparency of procedures of distribution, creating confidence through proximity are all critical in our actions towards deploying a neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian action. I'm proud that my colleagues in Syria, Ukraine, Iraq, South Sudan, and in many other places are continuously managing to find pragmatic solutions inspired by humanitarian principles to overcome such obstacles. ICRC is present today in all parts of Ukraine, doing cross-line in Syria, assisting those many times displaced in the most remote places of South Sudan and Yemen, and chartering its way in some of the most difficult environments in Iraq. The ICRC has at heart its historic contribution in the elaboration of the principles to guide the deployment of international assistance and protection programs. These principles have been codified to a large extent in international humanitarian law. They emerged from a long humanitarian tradition of preserving the life and dignity of all those affected by armed conflict without any distinction towards sick and wounded in the battlefield, the prisoners of war and security detainees, as well as the civilians caught in the crossfire. Whoever wishes to brush up its knowledge should visit the Red Cross Museum, which illustrates the emergence of humanitarian principles through history and cultures. It is important to remind ourselves, as these principles are questioned by too many today, that humanitarian principles are not the emanation of Western values, but deeply rooted in all the different cultures. In an open letter to the head of ISIL, Islamic scholars of all currents of belief have illustrated just 2 days ago how deeply rooted some fundamental humanitarian principles are in Islamic tradition and doctrine, and how far away from these principles the behavior of extremist groups today are. These principles have also been shaped by practice over several decades. Humanitarian activities often take place in contested areas governed by loose coalitions of state and non-state entities. ICRC's diplomacy of access is based on a continued process of negotiation to set its presence in these areas, maintain proximity to the affected people and communities, and seek the consent of the relevant parties to allow humanitarian operations to take place. This is, as everybody knows, a risky and often very frustrating long process. We negotiated for months a cross-line operation in Aleppo, a license to operate in Sudan, minimal security guarantees for our field operations in Afghanistan, and many more examples. Because of the lack of progress in such negotiations, very often populations are unattended, suffering, or dying. Our experience illustrates that the maintenance of a space of shared humanity that can resist to the temptation of politicization or militarization of relief efforts is not a concept spontaneously shared by everybody. In a period where polarization, extremism, demonization, and stigmatization are widespread and affecting body politics in many countries, and not only in remote areas, the notion of shared responsibility of all belligerents for humanitarian space in which civilians are protected and prisoners treated humanely is not an easy sell. Just pass a second in front of your eyes the pictures from the recent ICRC exhibition at Musée Rat, where prisoners of war are shown playing cards in leisurely guarded environments during the First World War, and compare it to the practice and rhetoric today. I'm sure you agree that this does not look like progress of civilization or a reaffirmation of humanitarian space. A key characteristic of this space is that all actors have the same role and responsibility in ensuring the assistance and protection of vulnerable populations. The failure of one party does not discharge the others from their duty. Equally, humanitarian assistance and protection is not the prerogative of a single party, state, non-state, or multilateral organization. Through the presence and support of the neutral and independent organizations such as ICRC, the parties are able to preserve this space despite political tensions and to consider regulating the effects of hostilities on the populations. The concept as well as practices of principled humanitarian action are increasingly being challenged in current conflicts. Parties to conflict themselves may explicitly desist from this project of shared humanity for ideological or political reasons, as witnessed in several instances over the recent years, when the so-called enemy population is wholesomely and collectively dehumanized and degraded. The persistent demand to humanitarians on whether aid beneficiaries are in government or opposition-controlled areas reflect the same dangerous trend, to design programs according to political orientations of populations and not to needs. The legitimacy of principled humanitarian action is also being challenged in a more paradoxical way by a number of national and international actors who purposefully mix essential emergency programs with political, security, development, and otherwise transformatory goals. We see an increasing number of programs and donor criteria which expect humanitarian actors not only to cover humanitarian needs, but also lay the ground for gender equality, social equity, and sustainable development. While the integration of relief and assistance activity in such transformative agenda provides significant benefits in terms of sustained developmental goals or the promotion of human rights, it definitely comes at a cost. At the cost of politicizing the shared space of humanity, at the cost of marginalizing or even antagonizing parties, and at the cost of restraining avenues of collaboration and engagement. Together, all these elements come at a heavy price of hindering access to populations in need. The debate here is not one of principles, but is about pragmatism. The ICRC has learned along its history that the implementation of its humanitarian mission will require contextual balance of interest regarding its neutrality, independence, and even in some case, its impartiality. While it will never negotiate on its core goals of preserving the life and dignity of everyone affected by conflicts and similar situations of violence, it is dedicated to engage in all confidentiality with all the parties to discuss and accommodate, as far as ever possible, other political, social, and security constraints. It remains pragmatic and does not take side on these or any other aspects of the conflict. It ensures that the experience and professionalism of its staff relentlessly negotiates the best possible deal in specific circumstances and at a given moment to maintain a space for humanity. This, again, is not an issue of abstract principles. It's an issue of pragmatic solutions inspired by principles. The required debate today on pragmatism is not so much, very frankly, on the side of the ICRC or other principled organizations like MSF, but on the side of NGOs, multi-mandated agencies, donor governments, and international actors that have vowed to serve both the humanitarian needs of affected populations and the transformation agendas of the national or international communities. In theory, we all share the same aspirations for global peace, development, and security, as well as the understanding about the limits of humanitarian action in addressing or preventing the causes of crisis. In practice, however, our experience shows that emergency access to vulnerable populations in some of the most contested areas depends on the ability to isolate humanitarian goals from other transformative goals, being economic, political, social, or human rights related. A specific pragmatism is required to operate in these areas, from Syria to Yemen, from Mali to Myanmar, that allows all the parties to recognize their shared humanity in the goals of the humanitarian organizations present on the ground. In absence of this recognition and dialogue, our ability to intervene in favor of affected populations diminishes considerably. There are evidently exceptions to this understanding. In situations where parties have persistently desisted from their humanitarian responsibility and denied access to the most vulnerable groups, different, more forceful approaches are required and explicitly regulated by the UN Charter. But this very clearly is not anymore the area of humanitarian, but of political action. In many situations, however, the only way to access populations rely on seeking the consent through dialogue and not coercion. Parties to conflict, state and non-state alike, need to see benevolent actors availing themselves to assist them in implementing their humanitarian agendas. Such an approach does not prevent us to shape and form humanitarian action as a building block or a foundation for more ambitious response systems, if such ambition is supported by a large consensus. But it imposes self-limitation first and the ability to build and broaden consensus afterwards. Let me come to make some concluding remarks. Emergency humanitarian response is and should remain a distinct professional domain from conflict resolution processes, development programming, stabilization efforts, and the transformation of societies based on universal human rights. Principled humanitarian action and diplomacy is about the preservation of its neutral, impartial, and independent space. An embodiment of our shared humanity that persists even in the most challenging circumstances of armed conflicts and natural disasters of tomorrow. But let me be very clear on this as well. Distinct approaches do not mean unwillingness or inability to exchange, coordinate, and cooperate. On the contrary, the distinct character of humanitarian action needs, in today's environment more than ever, tireless engagements to understand and define the interface between different actors and agendas. the research for complementarity, coordination and cooperation wherever broad consensus allows. In that sense, let me express my hope that the next Red Cross conference and the subsequent World Humanitarian Summit will not become remote islands on which humanitarian organizations and bureaucrats work through their predefined agendas and discourses. These are too serious times to engage in business as usual. We need international gatherings, putting needs of people first, and true engagement on how best to respond, and not only conversations amongst humanitarian organizations. We need to have a serious and forward-looking debate and hopefully reach some understandings on how humanitarian action relates to the broader international agenda, how it interfaces with security, development, human rights, and peace aspirations, and how we finance in an equitable way the growing needs, and how we intertwine in a more creative way local, regional, and global efforts. With a series of international gatherings in 2015, from revisiting the Yoga Framework for Action, the Millennium Development Goals, to the Red Cross and Red Crescent Conference and the World Humanitarian Summit, the field is wide open to a better deal for people in need. I thank you. And I understand you want to ask questions now. I'm fine standing.
Thank you so much, Peter Maurer. So the floor is open. There are micros somewhere. So please, who wants to start? Please introduce yourself. Here, or over there. Just a minute. The micro is coming.
So first I need to introduce myself. I'm Bassem from Egypt. I'm interning here in WHO in the field of climate change. Also, I'm working in the IFMSA in the field of DRR, which is somehow, and DRM as well, disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management. And we work a little bit in the field of disasters, so we're pretty interested in that field. So now my question is, I need some examples for diplomacy that promotes humanitarian action. I know that debate is important and debate is essential to produce anything, but I mean, is there any specific examples from the history, maybe the near history, to say that diplomacy had enhanced the humanitarian action? That's my inquiry.
I alluded to it briefly, but I can extrapolate a little bit. I mentioned to you, for instance, negotiations, painful negotiations for access in Aleppo. This is a typical example where for months ICRC at all levels, delegates in the field, at headquarters, and including myself, at all levels have been engaged with the Syrian government, with the local authorities, with the opposition armed groups controlling part of Aleppo, to find modalities which would allow us to deliver major humanitarian assistance to a city which hasn't seen any humanitarian assistance in months. And those negotiations were dragging along because they were going to who controls the good, at what time, and how are they shipped, and what exactly are the goods imported into Aleppo, and what is a humanitarian good, and what is a strategic good, which would eventually strengthen the military capacities of the other side. So there is a huge agenda and a panoply of issues popping up when you go into a diplomatic negotiation at all levels in order to negotiate access into the city of Aleppo. And I think it is important to highlight that such negotiations, as painful as they are at the same time confidence-building measures that when the operation unfolds afterwards, and it has unfolded because twice in a row ICRC has been able in the last weeks to bring more than 20 trucks into Aleppo, including cross-line operations. And I think when we have a diplomatic negotiations finding an agreement, and then the execution of the agreement, which is in sync with the diplomatic negotiations, then you have, as a gain, confidence. And I think the good example then allows you to kick the ball forwards in another diplomatic negotiations, which will go on to access to other cities in Syria. I think it's just one of the examples, but you could have the very visible and broadly discussed issues of the Russian convoys, where the success story is not so clear, to put it mildly. We were able to negotiate an agreement between Russia, Ukraine, the local authorities in Lugansk and ICRC on the clearance of the Russian convoy at border, its transfer to Lugansk, and its distribution in the city of Lugansk. The agreement over several days of day and night negotiations was agreed upon. The problem was in execution, because at a certain moment, security arrangements and the real security that our delegates found on the ground were not in sync with developing a humanitarian operation at a certain time. So these are just two of the examples which illustrate what's happening in 50 conflicts of the world almost daily, and each of the negotiations is a little bit different. But what I wanted to refer to is that in those negotiations, it's not just pragmatism, they are also long negotiations, because we want modalities to be found which are in sync and are credibly related to humanitarian principles. And so it's the equation of principles and practice which make these negotiations sometimes complicated.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you to give me the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Maurer, for your presentations. Mr. Maurer, you mentioned at the end of your presentation, Hugo framework, which we should end it next year. Hugo framework to reduce the risk of natural disasters. Yes, humanitarian are one of the main actors. It is, yes, humanitarian, but it is also services offers for civilian or others. But I want to ask you about health diplomacy and humanitarian diplomacy, because humanitarian, Red Cross, Crescent, any other organizations, post-armed conflict or post-natural disasters, we are taking care, health care of civilian mainly, first of all, or more than health care, other things than health care for health specialists.
Well, where do I start? First, as I mentioned beforehand, health for over more than 150 years has been the core, or one of the core activities of ICRC, and over the 150 years of history, we have carried over to the present a broad experience of delivering health services in armed conflict and other situations of violence. Our delivery of services has brought us today to identify recurring problems in delivering health services, and many of you may have heard about the important initiatives we have started more than 2 years ago on healthcare in danger, which focuses on sensitizing, and first on fact-finding, and then on sensitizing all actors, states, non-state health deliverers, to the issue of violence in health services. So our diplomacy today, or humanitarian diplomacy, is focusing very much on engaging with all sides in the chain of delivering health services to prevent and fight against the impact of violence in health services. We had, at another time here in Geneva, quite an important debate which has highlighted the fact that violence in health services is not an issue which is limited to armed conflict, but is touching many countries of the world. After 2 years of consultation, which again was part of the humanitarian diplomacy of ICRC, and regional workshops with health practitioners and politicians, we have come to a series of recommendations which I would cluster in 2 broad areas. I think we have recommendations today with regard to the behavior and legislative framework that states can engage in order to protect health workers in a better way. And we have recommendations with regard to the behavior, professional protocol, ethics of health workers, and how we can train and engage with them so they make themselves less vulnerable to violence. So ICRC's humanitarian diplomacy has focused a lot on this issue and is continuing to focus on the strengthening of the health sector by fighting the impact of violence on health workers, which in many places of the world, as we have shown, leads to the disintegration of health systems. If we have seen resurgence of polio on the Afghan-Pakistan border in north of Nigeria, in Syria, it's because health system breakdown through conflict. And so our efforts have been to engage all parties and all sides, to be aware that fighting and impacting or exposing health systems to violence is basically one of the most dangerous behaviors you can engage to in conflict. But because it leads to, not only in short term, to a situation where people do not get their health services, but in long term, it leads to the disintegration of health system. It's one of the biggest problems we are facing in the Middle East at the present moment. Syria operates under 50% of capacity of health delivery systems from pre-war times. 50% of doctors, nurses, and installations have been either killed, displaced, destroyed. The people who have been displaced are putting an enormous pressure on health systems in the neighboring countries. So armed conflict is disintegrating health systems, and therefore the sort of violence on health becomes a public health concern of global proportions. Because when systems are weak, people get sick, not only get wounded from war, but get sick and you have the global impact. So just wanted to explain our strong engagements and the strategic importance of impact of violence on health systems and health deliveries.
Thank you very much for your excellent and very fruitful presentation. And my name is Aragawi. I'm a student from Sarah. I'm from the Humanitarian Action student, and I'm very happy to listen for all the challenge and constraints that we are facing in the club now. And I'm wondering to know about the intervention of international community, especially we know that the UN, the three pillar points of the UN are like humanity, security and peace, and then development. And at the same time, we know also states are accountable and they are responsible for respecting these pillars. And on one hand, we see the conflicts or the problems are mostly, almost 90% that you mentioned, the countries are in Africa and the Middle East. And on the other hand, also, we see some international actors, like states, they react immediately to some places, but they ignore completely the other places. I can mention, for example, now ISIS. Now states are reacting immediately, but we can see in Assad, in Syria, they are facing a number of problems. We see that international community didn't react to that. We can see also African countries, they are facing a number of problems. I mentioned like Sudan, and now the current problem about Ebola. There were different years before it was become epidemic like this now, that we were able to control it, I guess. And I didn't see now why we react some places immediately, and the other places we are highly reluctant. And I would like to know about your collaboration with the UN, especially with Security Council, the five pillar powerful countries. I would like to know more about how you are working with them, especially in reforming the UN, like the 5 countries, superpower countries. I think the problem is there, to my personal view, because once you have the profit, you can decide. If you don't have the profit, you cannot talk about humanitarian action. So otherwise, it's going to be instrumentalized, politicized. Every time we are going to be away from the humanitarian subject or motive that we have. And to be brief and short, I would like to know more about how your collaboration with the UN and the other interventions. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. It's a very good question. Maybe there are a couple of other people who could more authoritatively respond to how engage and act with regard to real or perceived international double standards of behavior. I'm not going into the territory of judging states on their political posture, decisions, actions. I can tell you what informs our engagements as humanitarians when we engage in conflict. And our first and foremost guideline of engagements is solid needs assessment. We go into operations when there are needs, and we try to prioritize our operations and our exposures according to needs. We are encountering problems when prioritizing. We are encountering obstacles to bring assistance where needs are, and we are trying to negotiate and to overcome those obstacles in negotiations. In doing so, we try to have a credible, neutral, and impartial humanitarian action. Now, I don't want to sound naive. We are part of the international community after all. We have a mandate of states, of high contracting parties. And the high contracting parties who have given us a mandate through the Geneva Conventions are at the same time the parties who sit as states in international fora, in the Security Council, in the General Assembly, in the African Union Peace and Security Council. And so we naturally do engage with states in order to draw their attention to their obligations in terms of the conventions for which we feel being the guardian, the Geneva Conventions, but we would limit ourselves to what our mandate is. So while I always have to say I fully understand the questions, the perceptions, the frustrations which come with the inactivity of the certain international fora, and bodies like the Security Council in certain cases, or sometimes frustration because of the activities in other cases. This is clearly a political question to which ICRC has not, should not, and will not take position. But what I can say is that our engagement with the Security Council and the members of the Security Council are first and foremost on one specific issue. And it's the issue of humanitarian space and humanitarian responsibilities according to the Geneva Conventions. Our engagement is always also to appeal to them that as long as they do not find agreement on the very political problems which cause humanitarian suffering, that we will always be only marginally able to relieve suffering. The reason of all the victims we are encountering is most of the time failure of the international political system to come forward with solutions which give frameworks in which people can survive decently. So our engagement with the Council are in drawing their attention to the fact that if they are not becoming active and stucking their heads together and bringing solutions forward, we will have to deal with an increasing caseload of humanitarian problems. And secondly, our engagement with the Council is really to remind them on their obligation as high contracting parties to the Geneva Convention, and this is to respect and ensure respect of the conventions. Sorry not to be more precise, but the question is good.
Thank you very much. My name is Ilya Ivanov. I study at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. My first question was in fact already answered, so I'll get to my second question. You were talking about the necessity not to mix goals, humanitarian goals with development goals, with peace-building goals, but one of the issues at stake in different conflicts is to somehow find a holistic response to the crisis. And in this case, do you see the coordination with different bodies, be it NGOs or states or INGOs, as a possibility, and in which framework and under which, maybe law, this coordination may be established and may be beneficial? Thank you very much.
I think what I wanted to convey is that while we do understand all the advantages of integrated, coordinated, holistic, and whatever adjectives you throw at the issue, approaches, we also have to draw the attention of everybody to the big dilemma if we mix up humanitarian objectives and processes and principles with those further-reaching transformatory agendas. While, again, I can fully understand why it is important to engage, I tried to convey also very clearly that if you mix up the humanitarian agenda and objectives and mode of operations with those holistic and integrated policy approaches, you risk to sacrifice access to populations which need the work of the humanitarians. So this is not an easy task. It's not a solvable problem. It's a tension which is here and through which we try to ensure and to find practical solutions and implementation of humanitarian action which is consistent with principles and ensure access to populations in need. Now, as I alluded to, this does not mean that you cannot interface with the more ambitious agendas. But the way we like to do it is really a bottom-up and not a top-down approach. We are very happy to cooperate and to coordinate with all those who are where we are and to see how we can do more. There is no question, there is no problem in cooperating very closely, and we do, for instance, in many parts of the most serious crises at the present moment, we have very dense and intense cooperation and even integration of operations with Médecins Sans Frontières in South Sudan, in Central African Republic. We use the same aircrafts, we use the same operation theaters in hospitals, we do war surgery, they do public health. We are deeply integrated in delivering those services, but this is easy because they share the basic principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence. It becomes much more difficult. What do you do in Somalia or the Democratic Republic of the Congo when UN agencies, HCR, World Food Programme, are part of an integrated UN response, as good and reasoned as this response may be, but is effectuated in the framework of Chapter 7 resolution of the Security Council. The humanitarian action of those UN bodies is perceived by the Al-Shabaab and the rebels in the rural areas of the Congo as an international intervention and not at all impartial and independent. So we take our distance from cooperating and coordinating in those instances with those humanitarian actors, which for good reasons and understandable reasons are where they are, but we nevertheless take our distance because we think that we can only credibly and sustainably maintain our stature of neutral, impartial, and independent if we take some lines and we draw some lines. This does not mean that there is no communication with the peacekeeping operations or with the humanitarians in the Congo. We can still talk. We can talk with them in Somalia. We can see that we don't do silly things and both do the same or counter, or one program counters the other. But it's still an area where we are extremely cautious on how to do it. But the baseline for us is we like to cooperate and coordinate with all those who are there. And we are not very eager to cooperate in frameworks and structures far away from problems, populations, and perpetrators to whom we want to be close in order to ensure respect for humanitarian law.
So, Monsieur Maurer, thank you very much. Just as a follow-on perhaps in talking about the importance of the principle of humanitarian space as well as do no harm, I'm curious, you were mentioning that some donors are increasingly having as part of their criteria certain requirements. Could you elaborate a little bit on those points and also perhaps reflecting on the point that this gentleman made about Ebola, thinking about how civil-military cooperation is increasingly becoming paramount in some certain instances and how what the implications of that would be for the principles of humanitarian space?
Let me give you an example, which is probably the best illustration. If you want to have access in rural Afghanistan in order to develop a health project or to do a vaccination campaign or to do a food distribution, and you tell the Taliban with whom you have to negotiate access to do what you want to do, that you can only do it if this % of your staff is women, and or this %, or that you have an ambition to have a health center which is run by these and these persons, be they women from one place or the other of the world, you have to make a choice. It's a transformative agenda. I can understand that a development agency wants to promote women equality in the world. But in concrete terms, you come to the choice whether either you can help survive people who need it, or you don't do because what you do is not compatible with the aspiration of gender equality. So we are constantly confronted with those issues. Now, of course, we try to negotiate arrangements which are close to those aspirational goals of donors. But then you nevertheless come to the tragic choice at a certain moment where you have to decide of either you do it or you don't, and these are modalities you can accept or you can't. And as humanitarians, you always accept unacceptable conditions. That's the baseline. Sorry, I didn't respond to the second question. Help me. Yeah, the civil military. Well, look, I think Ebola is a good example where the whole international community, including the humanitarian actors, will have to revisit what they have said in the last 20 years. Because if all the humanitarians say we can't cope, and all the humanitarians are calling for military command, control structures, and capacities, we are outside of all the frameworks that have been agreed upon in distinction between civilian and military operations and cooperation frameworks between civilians and military. So it's maybe premature now to conceptualize and to see how the discussion unfolds. But I think it has been a big way forward in moving the conceptual debate from where it was through the Oslo guidelines decades ago almost, where civil-military cooperation frameworks were defined by the international community, and the fact that today we are confronted with dimensions in which many are tempted to say we will only be able to cope with them if there is command, control, communication, and capacity, which normally comes with military effectives. So I leave the question open. I don't know yet, but you can ask me in a couple of months.
We take 3 more questions. If you
There's something wrong with the mic.
Is that me?
I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's a...
My name is Hani Sayed. I teach law at the American University in Cairo. I'm here just passing by Geneva. I would like to start by emphasizing how radical is your idea of delinking the humanitarian action from its complex. But there is a little bit of a difficulty of imagining how is that going to actually unfold. The domain of the humanitarian now is not something the way you define it as very narrow. It's actually a domain of global governance, the same way markets are a domain of global governance, which means that the dilemmas that you mentioned at the beginning of your lecture are actually the effect of political actors assigning to the humanitarian actor the task of solving or making political choices that they're not willing to make. So humanitarian becomes a proxy for political action in the first place. So which means that the domain of the humanitarian is not something that you can control It is something that is drawn and carved up for you to operate in as a humanitarian actor. And here, it must be that we need to introduce a distinction between the field level work and high level diplomacy. So much of the pragmatic solution that you've talked about are very much understood on the level of the field when we are confronting a particular situation. But how we could actually escalate that and enlarge the scale to think about it on a policy level is the difficult thing to imagine. But thank you very much.
Well, I never felt about me as a radical, but maybe you bring a very new perspective into my life. I try to think about me as being radical. I think if I may contradict, our area of operation is neither determined by us alone, nor is it carved out by others. What I wanted to allude to is that it's negotiated and has to be negotiated, and the negotiations are directed by and informed by humanitarian principles. And I think we both know, and you have said what the trend is, and we are not blind. This is the trend of, and I mentioned it myself in my speech, that the trend is politicization and militarization of humanitarian action and trying to instrumentalize what you call carve-out roles for certain agencies and activities. My hope here, very frankly, is that the reality will contradict the assumptions which come from political debates. Fact is that we are where many others are not. And at the end of the day, I still have a little bit of hope that the humanitarian diplomacy of ICRC will be able to draw lessons and facts and bring facts and lessons from the field to the diplomatic arena. That's part of my job, to try to inform the policy debate and to say what brings success. And at the present moment, if you look at rural Afghanistan, the south of Yemen, the south of Somalia, rural Congo, the north of Mali, Aleppo, Syria, there are not so many others who are successful, and there are none of those who have embraced, first have embraced integrated, holistic, and so on. And there are not so many who have let themselves carve out a place which are particularly successful in the carved out place. So I'm pretty sure that we have a case here. And I'm not pretending that this is easy. But what I am clearly determined, and what we are all determined at ICRC, is to try it out and to stand the jury of reality and not just of concepts and words. So,
here.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. My name is Omar. I'm from Egypt as well. Being an Arab indeed, make me really understand the significant role of the International Committee of the Red Cross and the international humanitarian organizations in general, and especially in alleviating the suffering of the Arab people affected by armed conflict, whether in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Gaza, and Sudan, and elsewhere. But listening to your presentation and being aware also of the situation on the ground, I wonder if it's still possible to apply the idealistic humanitarian principles with the complexity of the legal and political situation on the ground. I mean, we all know that ever since the Second World War and the end of it in 1945, we don't really see interstate conflicts anymore. We don't have the classic warfare. We see more non-international armed conflicts, or what is so-called the other situation of violence, where you have internal disturbances that did not reach the threshold of the non-international armed conflict. So in this situation, when you ask about the humanitarian interference or the humanitarian aid, you go back to the Bible of the humanitarian aid, which is the Geneva Conventions. And the Geneva Conventions was kind of drafted and crafted in a way that is very state-centered. And in order to deliver any humanitarian assistance in a non-international armed conflict, if you want to deliver an assistance to the rebels, you have to get the approval of the government as well. What is the possibility that the government would accept any assistance to their enemies? I mean, let alone if they are declared as a terrorist, or, you know, like, there are more complexities. So my question again is it could be, you know, like, sticking very much to the humanitarian principles in their very idealistic way could marginalize the role of the international humanitarian organization in a way. Don't you think that we could possibly reinterpret the humanitarian principle in light of the current or ongoing challenges, whether legal or political, that we are facing nowadays in the field? Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, I hope I haven't given you the impression of being spinning around idealistic principles. That's not what I wanted to convey. What I wanted to convey is very much in sync on what you said, that these are challenging times because conflict patterns are changing and actors are changing and battlefields are changing, and the rules may not be as elaborate as they have been for international armed conflict, for the kind of conflicts which we find today. Second, let me just remind everybody that the Geneva Convention still is the only international instrument which puts obligations of armed groups, non-state actors. And there is no other international instrument which puts obligations and has a cliffhanger in its convention which frames what we are experiencing today. I share your views that one of the big problems is that the demonization of oppositions and of contestation and of armed groups into just terrorists and framing everything as an anti-terrorist operation is making even the small existing legal framework within the Geneva Conventions today are sometimes difficult and challenging to adapt. Now, once again, what I would convey is a perspective of hope and also of flexibly trying to use the existing instruments in order to enlarge the scope for humanitarian action, even in the most difficult circumstances. Formally, you are right. We are respecting the sovereignty of states when we do humanitarian operations in those states. But as I mentioned beforehand with the example of Aleppo, we are also negotiating to try to find ways to deliver in those areas where armed groups are active. And we are trying to engage with those armed groups to talk them into behavior of international humanitarian law with regard to detainees or with regard to security arrangements for humanitarian actors. Now, this is what we can do at the present moment. I don't say that the legal framework of humanitarian operation today is perfect, but it's what we have. And we have to try to stretch to the utmost because of the needs which are emerging. So what we do since 1977 is basically to use the framework we have and to try to use this instrument and to build operations by consensus as we move into those difficult areas. And as I said beforehand, I'm the first one to recognize that consensus is not the solution to everything. Although I'm Swiss, I have to recognize that this is a stark reality. The only thing I say is that when we leave the area of consensus building, we quickly enter into the area of political decision making, and then it's not anymore the part to which I can and want to respond as president of ICRC.
I'm Marco Sassoli. I teach international law at the University of Geneva. Thank you very much for your sober analysis. I have a question, and don't hesitate to depress my students and me with your answer, because I think that the truth, even when it is depressing, is a good starting point to change things. What is the role of international law in humanitarian diplomacy? Not at the Security Council, because there you mentioned it, and I fully understand it, but with armed groups and belligerents, what is its role compared with humanitarian, political, or pragmatic arguments?
Well, I'm sorry, Marco, I'm not going to depress you. I think it remains an important framework of engagement. The question is less whether, the question is more, to put it in other terms, the question is more how you use it in your engagement with armed groups. But I mean, what we are doing when we run training sessions with non-state armed groups, and we run a lot of those training sessions, when we engage with armed groups and negotiate for access, security to people or to detainees, we always use the framework of the normative framework that we have. Sometimes we translate it into adequate Islamic norms when we are operating in this space. Sometimes we express ourselves in other terms than just praying the liturgy of Article 3. But there are different forms and formats on how you can convey the message, but the substance of the message is not profoundly different, and the substance is the framework in which we engage armed groups. And as many of you know, we are not engaging structurally and continuously with as many armed groups as with states, but almost. We have continuous dialogue, engagements with more than 100 non-state armed actors. And this engagement is about concrete cooperation, is about access to people under control of those non-state armed groups. It's about minimal respect of dignity for detainees, dignified treatment for detainees. It's about the essence of humanitarian space and humanitarian treatment.
Je crois que le temps a tourné et qu'il nous faut vous remercier, Peter Maurer, pour cette très passionnante soirée, en espérant vous avoir parmi nous, disons dans 2 ans. Quand vous étiez ambassadeur de Suisse auprès des Nations Unies, vous m'aviez vanté les voitures américaines en me disant que ce qui est formidable avec les voitures américaines, c'est que vous achetez une voiture et après 3 ans, elle est neuve parce que toutes les pièces ont été remplacées. Donc j'espère que ce n'est pas le cas pour un président du CICR, mais nous serons en tout cas très heureux de vous revoir. À bientôt.
Merci.